Another advantage of these bigger cameras and why I'm using this as an example is typically a camera like this camera's kind of outdated in a way because it's standard definition, but it is one of the best standard definition cameras you can buy. The Canon XL2, I think this camera runs about $3,500 new. But what you're paying for with these cameras is all of the controls are built into the outside of the camera. There's probably about 40 different controls right here. I don't have to go into the menu of the camera and fumble through different settings to find what I'm looking for to adjust the settings. For example, I've got iris control right here to open and close my aperture. I've got a shutter speed button right here to open and close my shutter speed. My zoom is right here on the camera. And I'm going to come back, my focus is right here on the ring of the lens. And I'm going to come back to this in a second to show you why a manual focus ring on the outside of your lens is really important for deer hunting. I've got a manual zoom here to zoom in and out. But going back to the focus, a manual focus ring that you won't find on some of your consumer cameras is what we call them. Cameras under $800, $500. You're not going to find a manual focus ring. And the advantage of that in the deer stand is that there's so much stuff in the middle ground when you're filming. Say you're panning on a deer that's walking through the woods at 40 yards. Most of your consumer cameras, you're probably going to have it on autofocus, or you really don't even have an option. It's just going to be on autofocus. So you're trying to follow the deer, and then in the middle ground, some vegetation or a vine or some tree branches comes into the lens. And you probably notice it on some of the hunting shows. The camera is going to jump and try to focus on those tree limbs, and it's going to pull your focus away from the deer. I run on manual mode with this camera, so once I pull a focus on that deer and I'm panning to follow that deer, no matter what comes into the middle ground, I'm going to keep a focus on the deer. And focus is extremely important with good videography. The last thing I want to tell you about as far as advanced camera operation and some of these terms, and I don't expect a beginner to remember all this stuff, but again, it's important to understand what's happening behind the scenes on whatever camera you may be using. But I want to tell you about what's called white balance. You might notice, next time you're watching a television show, pay attention. If it's like a reality show, pay attention to the cameraman following somebody from indoor to outdoor. You'll notice that as they move from an indoor setting to an outdoor setting, it gets really blue. And he'll flip a switch, then it'll look correct. That's because there's a difference between what's called the color temperature of indoor light and outdoor light. Indoor light basically has a color temperature of 3,200 Kelvin. Outdoor light is about 5,600 Kelvin. Outdoor light is much bluer, basically, than indoor light. And you can see it in your house. Next time you're sitting on the couch, look up at an incandescent bulb. Make sure it's incandescent and not fluorescent. Look at an incandescent bulb in your chandelier, and then look out the window. And if you can get the two in your same field of view, you'll notice that the outdoor light comes off as a really bluish hue. And basically, the white balance setting on these cameras, most of your consumer cameras have what's called automatic white balance. This camera has automatic white balance, but it also has a manual white balance setting. And the reason you want to use this manual white balance is to tell your camera what true white is. And typically, anytime you change lighting sources, you're supposed to white balance your camera. I'm going to show you an example of white balance. We just happen to have some white balance cards, several different color variations. I'm not going to go into detail about all the different color variations here, but it's to achieve some pretty cool effects if you want to white balance to a different color other than white. But 99.9% of the time, you're going to need to white balance to white. I've used white t-shirts, 8.5 by 11 inch pieces of typing paper. Anything white that you can find, I've white balanced on a vehicle before, just to tell your camera what true white is. And right now I'm going to show you, this is not true white. We've white balanced properly for this scene right here. I should be the proper color, I hope. But this is I guess a yellowish pink card. We're going to white balance to this card, and it's going to alter the color of the shot. For example, what you see here is an improper white balance. Basically, this is what a scene would look like if I white balanced indoor under a red, low Kelvin light, and then stepped outside into a high color temperature bluish tint. I'd turn blue. So what I would do is re-white balance outside to get the true whites back, because this is not true white that you see here, this is blue. I'd re-white balance, and if I were to go back inside under incandescent reddish lights, the whole scene would appear red again. So I got to retell my camera what true white is. Most of the time on these consumer cameras, they do a pretty good job of guessing what white balance setting they should include on the camera when you're running around in manual automatic mode. But you can test it out and run real quick from outdoor to indoor, and you'll see it takes a second to readjust. But I wanted you to understand the white balance setting, how light is controlled through the lens, and that's through, first of all, the aperture, by use of ND filters occasionally if it's really bright, followed by your shutter speed, followed by your gain. Remember, the only true and clean way to control light is through your shutter speed and your aperture. Your gain is basically an artificial boost of the signal. And the higher you boost it, the more grainier it's going to be. And on automatic mode consumer camera, when it gets really dark outside, you'll notice it. It looks like snow because it's trying to boost that signal as best as it can to give you something to see in your viewfinder. But that's what's actually recording the tape. So the bigger the lens, the better off you'll be in the field, especially deer hunting.